We are back, and we are joined now by Max Felker-Kantor, Associate Professor of History at Ball State University and author of Dare to Say No, Policing and the War on Drugs in Schools. Max, thanks so much for coming on the show today.
Happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
So you've written a previous book on basically the police state, cops, and did a lot of work in LA on that book in particular. Why did you choose to turn to D.a.r.e. now? Because people have those D.a.r.e. t-shirts now and they wear them ironically, but it really was this massive move. I mean, even when I was coming up, going to school in the 90s and early 2000s, right, as a younger kid, we had D.a.r.e. officers come or police officers come and speak about the D.a.r.e. program, but it was so massive in the 80s and 90s.
Yeah, it really was. And I mean, the reason why I came to write about D.a.r.e. is that when I was finishing that first book you mentioned, which was called Policing Los Angeles, I came across all this material about D.a.r.e. in these LAPD kind of archives that I'd been using in the mayoral archives in Los Angeles. And I was like, whoa, what did D.a.r.e. started in LA? And so that's where I kind of got the idea of thinking about, because the same thing, I did D.a.r.e. as a kid in the early 90s, not in Los Angeles, and was like, how did D.a.r.e. get from LA to my school and then everywhere else that, kids were wearing t-shirts, wearing ironically later, by the late 90s, early 2000s. And so I really just wanted to investigate, how did this program grow to become so big? Why did it start in Los Angeles? And why did the police want to kind of put police officers in schools as teachers? Is sort of where I started this whole project, and to think about the role that D.a.r.e. played in the 80s and 90s in the culture and politics of that era.
And I mean, this is when the war on drugs is in full swing, right? I mean, it started in the 70s, ramping up aggressively so in the 80s and 90s. And it's not a coincidence, obviously, that as we begin to incarcerate more people for drug use and selling drugs, that this comes into the fold.
Yeah, no, not at all. D.a.r.e., when it starts under Darrel Gates, the kind of, infamous LAPD chief of police, they are in the midst of this aggressive drug and gang war in the 1980s. And it's not, the point I make in the book is it's not a coincidence that they're like, we need this alternative program to also try to address what they called the demand side of the drug war, and to tell kids how to prevent drug use, not just arrest everyone, but to prevent it. And so, but the point that we can see, I think, through D.a.r.e. and the use of police officers is that it was never entirely an alternative to this other drug war that's going on. As you mentioned, it's actually another police-led project that starts to define what we might see as social or health, related problems that are ones determined and defined now by the police as criminal ones or as carceral ones. And so it's defined, or it's kind of sold to the public as this alternative, but it doesn't really operate that way. And in part, that's because, as I suggest, it's that relying on police officers to be teachers, and those police officers are in uniform while they're in the classroom, right? So it's not all that different. But it's meant to kind of, at the same time, counter the very image that the police were kind of portraying on the street. Or you could see, if, as you know, probably the nightly news with these drug raids, right? Kind of militarized. This was meant to kind of soften the image of the police in the minds of kids.
And my recollection was just feeling scared. I'm scared of drugs, scared of what they were saying. And, there really could have been an alternate vision for this of restorative justice and education, but it's it's a link to police, and they made that at the forefront.
Yeah, exactly. And that's a very similar memory to what I had, right? When I came out of it, was I'm scared. I had this memory, and I write about this in the book a little, that for me, it's those other kids on these kind of other parts of town that are kind of make you join a gang if you don't do this, right? So it was fear about that, fear about drugs, and this fear of consequences, right? If you do drugs, you could, it could result in, you could die, right? I saw workbooks from people who shared their workbooks with me, still filled out from when they were kids, where they're like, what's one of the consequences of drugs? You could die, you could be arrested, right? You could go to jail, right? And that's the lesson the kids were getting. And so it's that kind of creation of fear about those consequences. And so even as it's portrayed as that alternative, it's still within that zero tolerance kind of model of zero tolerance of drug use. And it is totally, as you suggested, not, the kind of harm reduction, restorative justice that we've kind of come to more recently, that the Drug Policy Alliance and others have kind of promoted. And so it's a very different program in the 80s and 90s, when it's just like, no drug use, right? If you make the wrong choice, the consequences. And so it's that kind of idea of personal responsibility as well. If you make this wrong choice, here are these kind of alternative, consequences that you will face.
And it's really very much an aside, but there was so much media at that time that was like family friendly. My era was like Secret Life of the American Teenager or Seventh Heaven. These shows where it depicted you smoke a doobie and you are not only delinquent, but you might die as well. I mean, like that was a lot of what was being pushed. And I associate all of that, of course, with D.a.r.e.
Yeah, I mean, that kind of messaging all gets wrapped up in D.a.r.e. It's part of this larger ecosystem of, the Partnership for Drug-Free America and like the commercials, right, that everyone remembers of like, this is your brain on drugs. D.a.r.e. partners with Hanna-Barbera Productions, and they have Yogi Bear as their kind of spokesbear. So they're in all of that kind of popular cultural production to shape those messages as well, alongside Nancy Reagan's Just Say No and all of the stuff that's going on with that. And so it's all of that kind of popular culture media production to kind of shape what the Reagan administration at the time called, they wanted to de-glamorize drugs. And they wanted to do that through media. They enlisted athletes, right? D.a.r.e. partnered with athletes and other entertainers to try to kind of shape that image as well. So it's keying into all those kind of trends of that moment.
So I guess, you mentioned at the beginning how the LAPD started the drug program. Or the D.a.r.e. program, excuse me. Take us through that, the origins and how it kind of came to be.
Yeah, I mean, this is a fascinating moment. So D.a.r.e. begins in 1983. The first kind of pilot class is the fall of 1983. But before that, Darrel Gates, the LAPD chief, in the early 1970s, mid 1970s, they had already started a drug war in LA schools. And they did that by putting undercover officers into high schools to try to arrest drug dealers in those schools. And after about 10 years...
That's the premise of 21 Jump Street,
yes,
right?
It is, okay. Yeah. But it actually happened, right? They actually had officers going into schools arresting, sometimes arresting students, but often it was meant to be targeted at, quote, dealers, right? But kids get wrapped up, all those sorts of things. By 1983, the winter, Darrel Gates comes to the school board and says, we've been doing this program for almost a decade, and it hasn't reduced drug use among kids. And so he's like, we need an alternative. And his alternative that they work out over the summer of 83 is with the LAUSD, that Los Angeles Unified School District, to develop this new program of police-led drug prevention. Because they're like, well, we haven't been able to stop the supply of drugs and people are still using. But so now we're going to deal with the demand. And we want to do that by creating a curriculum that will be taught by uniformed police officers. And so they start that program in 1983 in the fall, in that first pilot year, in about 50 elementary schools. And then within about 2 years, it's in every elementary school in Los Angeles. And so they expand it very quickly. And it's that story of that origin of what I call, it's an origin story that I call is that D.a.r.e. is a product of failure, of police failure, because their kind of traditional strategies of arrest and trying to do these undercover operations didn't work. And so then they reroute and find a new avenue to try to wage this drug war, like kind of another means. And so that's this origin story. And then, of course, from LA, Darrel Gates was very intentional of saying, I am going to try to expand this program nationwide. And he's writing about it, and he's going to conferences, and he's talking to other law enforcement administrators and officials to promote the program. And so that's how it accelerates really quickly.
Yeah, and it also, as you mentioned, it served both to cover up the failures of the drug war, but also to present a different image of police officers, which is
Hmm.
interesting.
Right.
Because then there's already an understanding baked into it that police officers need a PR need some a rebranding in the context of this drug war
Right.
and what they're doing, what they're really doing.
Totally right. And it's like, and they don't like, and the rebranding is what they eventually start to say is, well, the reason why we need these police officers as teachers, like the argument on the face of it was often they know the sort of the stories from the streets. They're veteran officers who know all the stories, and kids will believe them. And so the point I make in the book is like these fifth graders, because it went into fifth grade classrooms, must have been so savvy about drugs that their normal classroom teachers couldn't tell them, like, let's have some health education around this, right? That they needed police to be the kind of experts that the kids would believe. But then they start always talking about how what the police officers are really doing is becoming the friends and mentors to kids, right? And so what you start to see is very early on, the officers would stay on the school campuses for recess and play with the kids. Some of them started things like D.a.r.e track clubs or coached football teams in the kind of extracurricular moments, at times after school. And so it's sort of creating this image of like, police officers aren't just here to arrest you. They're here to help you. They're here to kind of be your
Right.
mentor and guide you. And that's one of the things that even everyone starts saying in these early evaluations is, the kids start to say they have more respect for the police, or they follow rules better, or they're more disciplined, right? So there's this kind of disciplinary message to that kind of shift of image that isn't kind of, it's not on D.a.r.e.'s kind of promotional material, but it's really kind of what's happening underneath.
And you talk about it as the part of the school police nexus, right? You
Hmm.
use that phrase.
Right.
How do you feel that this contributed to a lot of what we see today with school
Hmm.
resource officers and cops in schools? We have a pretty big problem of
Hmm.
specifically in poor minority neighborhoods, cops arresting kids in schools and then furthering them down this cycle of incarceration and of poverty. This clearly, I think, was a gateway to that reality that we live in now.
Yeah, no, and I use this school police nexus framing, as you suggest, as a way to think about not just like the school to prison pipeline that many people are familiar with, but to see like schools and police actually working together, right?
Right.
Because they're working kind of in tandem and kind of in a reciprocal relationship because they're partnered in this. It's not just like imposing. They're actually they sign memorandum of agreement to work together in with these D.a.r.e programs, but it's an entry, as you suggest, to this larger kind of longer cycle that we see, because what I argue and what I think D.a.r.e does, because there were police in schools before this, police athletic leagues, kind of like officer friendly, but D.a.r.e brings these officers in on a kind of regular basis for 17 weeks, and it normalizes the police in schools in the ways that those prior programs didn't do to the same extent. And it's before you get school resource officers, which come later into the 90s. And so D.a.r.e kind of sows the ground of normalizing the idea of having uniformed officers on school campuses. And then originally, D.a.r.e officers in the 90s were not school resource officers. They were meant to be separate because they're like, we need the D.a.r.e officers to be the friendly, nice mentor.
Mm.
But later, post Columbine and the shooting there, they start to then say, we need to actually have all our D.a.r.e officers be school resource officers as well. So over time, by the late 90s, early 2000s, they actually merge to where they say, we should actually have the D.a.r.e officers be school resource officers. And so they become kind of that dual kind of role where they're both enforcement, but then also supposed to be these teachers, right? And so it facilitates that kind of continued presence of police in schools that has the kind of long-term effects that you're suggesting about the kind of arrest of kids, the racial inequality of those arrests of kids in schools, the disproportionate policing of kids of color, right, and marginalized communities, right? That all kind of fuels on it as well.
So how did D.A.R.E. get its funding from its outset to, I guess when it kind of became a national program?
Yeah, no, I mean, so at its outset, Darrel Gates kind of not siphons off, but kind of like says, I'm going to use some of my budget and rededicate officers. And he has this whole gripe with Mayor Tom Bradley, who's the first African-American mayor of the city in Los Angeles, where he's like, Tom Bradley's not giving us the resources we need for this great program. We're kind of sacrificing our own police, to go do this. So he frames it that way. And eventually the city does, it becomes this citywide program that's funded, through the police department. But they start one of the initial things they start doing is applying for federal grants through the Bureau of Justice Assistance. And they start to get these initial seed grants in the mid 1980s, 84, 85, in the realm of like $200,000 and then of $500,000. And that helps them start to actually build out a curriculum and training programs that they will use to spread the program. So that's one. But then eventually the other federal funding comes in through the Anti-Drug Abuse Acts of 86 and 88, which is the one that most people know that set the mandatory minimums and the crack to powder, ratio, the 100-to-1 ratio that many people know. But there's a part of that law that is called the Drug-Free Schools and Communities Act, and it sets aside money for prevention. And D.A.R.E. starts to get money through that act. And by 1990, when they do a revision, an amendment to that act, D.A.R.E. is actually named as a model program that other people could follow. And so they're getting federal funding.
Yeah. I'm just wanted to jump in there because you really could see an alternate model for having money for drug prevention. I think that is actually a great goal. But my understanding is that when the drug war started early on, actually Nixon included more funding in its initial outset for prevention programs, but it increasingly got cut into by more basically police and criminalization efforts.
Yeah, and you see that happen actually in the 1986, like these 1986 Anti-Drug Abuse Act, in the hearings where you have people like Charles Rangel and others, Augustus Hawkins, who's a representative out of Los Angeles, and they're talking about we need prevention, we need education. And you have William Bennett, who's the Secretary of Education at the time, going to these hearings, and they're all kind of talking about this. And they've set aside only initially $200 million out of a kind of $1 billion drug war funding. And so that's very small, even as they're sort of promoting, look, we've included prevention now, but it's like totally disproportionate to what they're spending on kind of the militarized side, the punitive side of the drug war. And so that dynamic is worked out, but and it grows a little bit over time, the prevention stuff, but it never kind of comes to the same, is never anywhere equal, right, to the kind of punitive funding of police, of border interdiction, of, source country kind of policing, and militarization there. So that inequality remains, but D.A.R.E. is able to tap into some of that federal funding. And then there's another source of funding we could talk about as well.
Sure.
Not just federal funding.
It's it's a nonprofit model, right?
Yes,
essentially.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yes. Because what they do in part in LA is they start to ask local businesses and local kind of, foundations and others to give donations to a kind of community prevention council that eventually funnels money largely to D.A.R.E. So they start getting checks from many of the Hollywood studios, from a number of corporations in the city. And so they start getting kind of corporate sponsorship into this nonprofit organization that eventually becomes what is called d.a.r.e. America, which is an organization, a nonprofit organization that still exists. It gets established in the mid to late 1980s as a nonprofit. It starts as d.a.r.e. California. It's a little more complicated than that, but for this purpose. And what they start to do is promote d.a.r.e. as this, for corporate responsibility. Corporations start saying, look, we're going to fund d.a.r.e. Look, we're backing this great prevention program. And they start to funnel kind of corporate sponsorship into it. And so, like, for example, one of the first national sponsors is Kentucky Fried Chicken, where they're like, where they sponsor the d.a.r.e. program. And then you get a whole range of others just kind of constantly. And then as d.a.r.e. spreads in different states, they have these different d.a.r.e. organizations in each state that are working with local communities to get funds as well, and to get fundraising that way. And it's an interesting kind of flip, because what it allowed d.a.r.e. to do by the early 90s, when we know that kind of, quote, big government's under assault, right? Mm-hmm. Even by the Clintons, is they said, well, we're not a government program. We don't get that much money from the government. But they're actually getting all this corporate sponsorship, and that's how they kind of use it. The thing they leave out is all the local police departments are donating their officers' time. So it's actually, most of that kind of resource is coming from public money, because they're getting, all the police officers are donated time to do that instruction, but they write that off as donated services, not as funding.
Interesting. And so where, lastly, is the program at now? Is it basically just existing in that nonprofit model space? Yeah,
it still is a nonprofit, today, and still exists. It's nowhere near the kind of same sort of kind of expansiveness as it was in the 90s. It goes through a whole series of crises in the 90s when all the social scientists come out and say, actually, this program doesn't prevent drug use. And so it comes under kind of fire for that. And it goes through these revisions. And so d.a.r.e. America still exists within that kind of nonprofit realm. It's still a nonprofit. There's also a wing of it called d.a.r.e. Worldwide, because it went international as well. It's located in Culver City as the headquarters, right? So it's which is a part, in the kind of Los Angeles area. So it still exists in that kind of realm as well.
Well, fascinating stuff, and I really appreciate your time today, Max Felker-Kantor. The book is called Dare to Say No, Policing and the War on Drugs in Schools. We will put a link to your book in the description and wherever people are listening or watching this, and at majority.fm. Thanks so much, Max.
Great. Thanks for having me.